Sanjeev, you have been a pioneer in throwing light on Indian history that were lost between the pages. And now you have championed a series of initiatives to unshackle India from myriad shackles. One of the most recent initiatives being to streamline patent filing, and one of my most favorite. And now you have taken up the clarion call on ESG as a mechanism to subvert our sovereignty and economic freedom. Could you explain to us all the issues around ESG and trade agreements that are leading to a subversion of the Indian economy?
So, firstly, let me thank all of you for inviting me to speak to you today. The issue of ESG is something that I've taken up in the last couple of years. So, let me tell, for those who don't know the background history of what this is, ESG, by the way, stands for Environment, Social and Governance Norms. And back in 2006, there was an innocuous UN document which first coined this term. Now, when it was coined, it came across as, we need to have certain environment governance and social norms which, should be applied globally and so on. And it was not defined there, so of course nobody would object. After all, who would object to having some basic governance norms or environmental norms and so on? But that paper totally did not tell you exactly what they meant by this. And over time, what happened, there was a sort of gathering of pace of all kinds of mechanisms and methodologies that were created, mostly by NGOs and non-state actors and think tanks and so on, and sometimes consultancies. And as a result of which, what happened is that you ended up with a bunch of methodologies which began to be applied. Now, it's okay. That was also okay. Initially, any experimentation will start like this. But what has happened as a result over the last 15 years is a whole ecosystem of these ESG norms, which have not been generally agreed by all parties, but have ended up getting applied in all kinds of spaces. Now, as long as this was theoretical, it was fine. But what is happening is that globally, global regulators, governments, and other, or even influential private initiatives are now using and almost imposing these ESG norms. Now, as I said, they evolved without any discussion. Some think tank, some NGO somewhere came up with one, and it began, and it was okay because of somebody's opinion. But now that it is public policy and a regulation of some sort, even if it happens to be, for example, sovereign rating, for example, which may be taking it into account, it is having real world implications. And if it is having real world implications, and I, as a business entity or an individual or a government department, whatever it is, I am expected to comply in some way with it, then surely it can only be meaningful if I have been in some way party to coming up with a set of sensible rules that are agreed. But this is not the case. Instead, what has happened is effectively these NGOs, think tanks, consultancies are now in a position of doing and imposing on the rest of the world certain rules which nobody agreed to. And in fact, even worse, not only are they imposing the rules, very often they are the one issuing the certification. They are the one who are deciding whether somebody is a good boy or a bad boy and charging for it. So imagine this is a form of jizya being actually extracted for giving certification on a set of rules which nobody agreed on in the first place. So just to give you some sense of what we are ending up with is, you will have a major government or somewhere particularly in one of the bigger economic conglomerations who will say that, now in order to export to us, you have to agree with some rules about green steel or green something or the other. And the way that you define green, whatever it is essentially in a way that requires you to use patents that same country holds. I'm just giving this as an example, but effectively this is a form of neo-colonial control. And unless everybody has had a good shot at agreeing to these rules, and you are called to the table when these rules were agreed, what else is it other than a imposition of external neo-colonial type of rules. Now, at least as India, we have both the intellectual and economic and geopolitical heft to push back. But if you take relatively smaller countries, particularly places like Africa and so on, they have no way of pushing back. And effectively, what will happen is that you have these rules being imposed, and you are not only having to comply with those rules, which you had no way of challenging, you are then having to pay a fee for certification to those rules. So, this is absolutely unacceptable in my view. I think there needs to be a real solid pushback against this, especially since many of these rules are completely absurd. And you have a situation where some of the countries with the highest ESG ratings are actually tobacco companies, taking credit for the fact that they grow tobacco and therefore are, or some such thing. So this clearly is, not tenable.
In fact, Sanjeev, this reverberates with what we discussed in the morning is exactly similar issues, but more from an IPR perspective. The same things being played out. And it's having real impact in terms of CBAMs being now created and being imposed. Could you just help us understand what is happening in that part and what's the plan of the Indian government to protect our industries from the impact of CBAMs emanating from the ESGs that you just mentioned?
So this is where we need to push back and say that this is not, that this is not an acceptable thing. Even if some rules have to be set, they have to be set in a multilateral sort of way, in which there is a even playing field. Otherwise, if anybody can impose any rule on anybody, then why have a WTO? Why have any kind of system? So I think we need to have a sensible global system of doing ESGs if we want to do ESGs. Otherwise, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be party to this clear neo-colonial project.
Thank you so much. I think those were pretty much similar words we used in the morning also, and I think Sanjeev has thrown very significant light on how that is being crafted as we move forward. I'll move to Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. India had entered into a set of trade agreements that became cause for concern for Indian businesses, and data shows the same. And you have been at the helm of it, analyzing the data as the Director General of RIS. What were the provisions in these FTAs that made Indian businesses to de facto lose market access in the counter economy, and how do we avoid such traps in future? Because India is now going ahead with many more FTAs, and there are concerns that the industry have. But I'm sure we have learned, and then how are we addressing those issues?
Thank you. Thanks, at the outset. I must congratulate you for bringing forward these issues together and in the backdrop that Sanjeev just now set so in such a profound manner for contextualizing the developments. I think there are three issues when it comes to FTAs. First and foremost is the second phase that we have entered in for free trade agreements. After this huge moratorium that was there, undeclared moratorium, from 2011 till 2019 when we closed our FTA with Mauritius and things multiplied. The fact that a huge criticism, a huge sort of resistance for FTA is largely because what you right now said in terms of our industry losing it, and we do not have wherewithals to put them together. Perfectly fine, and that's where we have lost opportunities, and we have also sort of destabilized the psychological framework. Our insistence on being out of RCEP is a clear reflection of people's expectations from the government. So that part is all set. Now I have been working in terms of what is the way forward, and you have seen with the UAE, with Australia, and also now with UK, the government's effort is to ensure interest of our own industry first. And one thing that CIM has been saying, and Prime Minister also earlier emphasized, is in terms of mutual respect for our respective sensitivities. And that I think is absolutely important and essential for us in terms of equal playing field when we are entering into agreements of this nature. But more than that, what is required is to put our house in order. And this is something where much more efforts are required. First and foremost is to put our statistical system in place, particularly related to trade statistics. The way DGCIS is working, and the fact that it is based in Kolkata and the spillover effects on its efficiency and working is something that is required to be. I have been suggesting that it should be taken out from Kolkata and shifted to Delhi so that productivity of that organization grows and the reliability of statistics is there. But I think it is important for us to see that trade statistics is adequately addressed. The fact that, as you know, in the harmonized system of trade classification, 6 digit is a global norm for trade classification. For 8 or 9 digit, 8 or 10 digit, you can go for your own sort of classification of products. The fact that India has started now exporting a lot of Ayurvedic medicines and several Ayush related products, lot of products where our own classification, Ayush is just one example, but there are several such examples. If you see simple trade statistics of changes across ATIS classification, you do not get time series data for 8 or 10 digit classification. So that's where our challenge comes in. Even coherence across 4 different changes that have happened in the ATIS classification, they are not there. So the first and foremost requirement for us when we are going for a trade negotiation is to put our house in order, particularly for statistics. Second and much more important, I think, is in terms of our ability to encourage traders to classify under what category goods are going. And that's where role of customs comes in. Because customs is not encouraging in terms of whether they are using MFN route or they are using the spatial advantages that trade agreements are giving. So as a result, those who are studying the impact, they are not able to work out precise gains for us. When at RIS we were doing a study of India, South Korea FTA, India, Japan FTA, India, Singapore FTA, we had to take data on our exports from those countries to understand how much our exporters have sent to them, because they classify, we don't classify, and we don't put the data. So I think in order to substantively understand the implications of FTAs from this point of view, our house should be put in order. I'm so thankful that Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council is pushing it, and the matter has already been taken cognizance of. Some efforts have already been made, and very soon you will see the new impact on these entities once the government is in place.
Thank you. I think that's very heartening to know that steps are being taken, and clearly data has been our Achilles heel for many sectors, including this. And I'm very tempted to also come back on the issue of MSME, but I'll do that subsequently, because that's another aspect that seems to be getting missed out, even though platforms are offered, but MSMEs don't have the ability and wherewithal to actually respond to. But I'll move to Professor Abhijit Das. And Professor Das, how do you see the parallels between colonialism and the current global framework of trade and investment that has evolved? And just to let you know, in the opening sessions, we delved deeper onto what Sanjeev was referring to as neocolonialism. And 2006, you're familiar with the work we did on digital colonialism, and you had commented on all of that work. So, would like to understand from you, how is the global frameworks playing out?
Thank you. Thank you, Jaijit. At the outset, I'm extremely grateful to the organizers for conceptualizing this wonderful event and providing me a platform to share some thoughts and be on this platform with such illustrious personalities. If we look at the main elements of a colonial economy, all of us would be familiar with it, but just to remind ourselves, first element was grab for resources, particularly natural resources, put in place a system whereby India is compelled to export cotton and that cotton gets processed, turned into shirts and other dress stuff in Manchester. So that was one very important characteristic of colonial economy. Linked with that was if the colonizing countries were rich in natural resources, impose restrictions on exports of those natural resources so that you can enhance the domestic availability for downstream processing. What UK did in respect of wool might be familiar to those of you who have studied colonial history. It prohibited exports of wool so that wool in turn could be processed domestically within England for making more value-added products. So that again links up with the first point. The second main feature was try to secure markets for your own products, finished products. And if you secure markets for your finished products, can you make sure that you knock off competition from other countries? In other words, can you acquire a monopoly on trade with other countries? Can you also prevent the colonized countries from implementing policies which would enable them to catch up with their colonial masters? Another feature, a very prominent feature of the colonial economy, was the empire, the kings, the governments. They very solidly backed their business interests. So even when East India Company was not directly, in a way, controlled by the British Crown, the British Crown did everything possible to push its commercial interests in India. What was the net result? All of you would be familiar. The famous drain of wealth characterization of a colonized economy. Now, if we look at what trade agreements have done, what investment agreements have done in the past, and what they are seeking to achieve now, the parallels with a colonial system is remarkable. Let's just take the example of, since Sanjeev mentioned ESG, a good illustration in this context would be EV, electric vehicle. That's required, supposed to be required for global decarbonization. An essential component of the electrical vehicle is the lithium battery. Where is lithium found? Mainly in Chile. What is the other important component of a lithium battery? Cobalt, copper, and a few other natural resources. What would the big players of electric vehicles do? They would want to import lithium, they would want to import cobalt, they would want to import copper, without allowing the country where these natural resources are found, without allowing them to move up from being mere miners to processors and treating other value-added products, right? What would a country rich in natural resource do? It would prevent exports of natural resources. All of you are with me so far? It could do that through imposing export restrictions. It could do that through imposing export taxes. Now, under the rules of GATT and WTO, blanket export prohibitions are not allowed. Countries have the flexibility to import export taxes, but, and here is the interesting part, through free trade agreements, Chile, which is one of the countries with the largest lithium deposit, cannot impose an export tax because it has lost the right to impose export tax through its free trade agreement with the United States. We are not, unfortunately, too far behind. We are under immense pressure in FTA negotiations, and I'm leaking no state secrets here. Look at the negotiating proposals put by the European Union to India. It's in public domain. They want India to get rid of export taxes. Look at the agreement called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF. There is something called a supply chain pillar, where we have almost created a window to accept in future we will not impose restrictions or other barriers on exports of material which might be critical to other countries. So the neo-colonial characteristic whereby countries which are rich in natural resources continue to remain exporters of natural resources without climbing the value chain, without creating a vibrant downstream value-added industry. That objective is now being achieved not by sending armies, not by sending gunboats, but through trade and investment agreements. Let me look at the second aspect, markets for products. And here again, environment is a very important consideration. Look at the free trade agreements which are being negotiated by the developed countries, UK, European Union, US. When it comes to the environment chapter, there's a broad recognition that each country has the right to decide the level of environment protection through regulation, whatever. And then there will be a provision which says we agree to adopt high environment standards. It doesn't say adequate, it says high. And some of the agreements also have, at least on a best endeavor basis, to harmonize environmental standards. Sounds good, right? We must adopt high environmental standards so that we will be emitting less carbon and it will be a good contribution in the fight against climate change. Think of the consequences. Do we have the technology to comply with high environmental standards? No. At least not yet. And if we are not able to comply with high environmental standards, if we were to adopt those standards, bear in mind, our producers in our own domestic market will not be able to sell those products. Next consequence, if our domestic producers are not able to sell those products, who will sell those products? Those who have the technology. Who have the technology? The developed countries. So environment is being used as a very potent instrument to pry open the markets in developing countries and knocking off competition from domestic producers. Let me touch upon just two important issues and then I will close. Drain of wealth. That was the net result of the colonial economy. Interestingly, this feature has not been studied too much in detail in the present context. I did a very quick analysis of Maruti Suzuki. Now it might sound go against the grain of economists, but I did a very simple calculation. What is the total investment of Suzuki into Maruti from day one? And what is the outflow from Maruti Suzuki to the company in Japan called Suzuki each year on account of royalty? You'll be surprised. On an annual basis, the outflow on account of royalty is anywhere between 30 to 35 times the cumulative inflow from Suzuki into Maruti Suzuki. Of course, this investment has created jobs, it has created huge economic opportunities. But just look at from the perspective of inflow and outflow of foreign exchange, you can see the huge imbalance which is built into the system. And let's not forget, even Indigo created employment in India. The last point which I wanted to make was I wanted to go back to the issue of grab for resources. The grab for resources is not limited only to natural resources like cobalt, lithium, iron ore, coal, etc. In the evolving economy, the grab for resources extends to data. Trade agreements have provisions which mandate free flow of data across borders. Some of the trade agreements also require countries to, at least on a best endeavor basis, share government data. This is nothing but grab for resource. Once we realize that what fuels the digital economy is really access for data. The last point on resources is fisheries. All of you or some of you might be aware that negotiations are happening at the WTO on fisheries subsidies. Well, sustainability of fishing, sustainability of marine life is just a veneer. The basic objective is to make sure that those countries who have created huge industrialized fishing fleets, they continue to have rule of the ocean, whereas countries like India or Indonesia, who are not yet in a position to have a large industrial fishing fleet, are deprived of the opportunity to create an industrial fishing fleet. Net result, we will never be able to become a big maritime power. The resources which are there will continue to be exploited by those who have the capacity presently, and we will be prevented from acquiring capacity in the future. In a nutshell, I hope all of you would agree with me that what is happening in the arena of trade and investment agreements has a resonance with what happened in the past. So with that, I'm going to stop, and thank you once again, Jaijit, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Das. It continues to be very, very enlightening. I have a few follow-up questions, but I'm just holding back because I know Pritam needs to leave for the Chintan Shiva, and Sanjeev is also pressed for time. So I'll press on, I'll come back. And I have a question on ITA. You know that question, I'm sure. I'll come back to it in the second round. Moving to you, Pritam, as head of Center for WTO Studies, you have been supporting the government in its negotiations in trade agreements. In that capacity, what are your views of the potential opportunities and challenges that emanate from these agreements? And you have been, working on the nuts and bolts of these. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Jaijit. And again, it's a real privilege to be in this panel. And kudos to you and the organization and the committee that's done this, put this together. I will, not take a different view from largely what has been said so far, but I'll probably take a more nuanced view. And since I'm assuming this is a closed door conversation, the nuanced view is not simply because I am associated with the government policy. It is a genuinely
closed door with an NDTV man.
I was hoping it.
Dangers of technology.
So what I will simply do is focus on the nuts, because we have had the macro view so far on each of the strands that we heard so far. Let's start at the very top. We can see dangers wherever we want to see it. At the end of the day, every country is pursuing its self-interest. This has always been the case. You cannot blame any country for pursuing the self-interest of its firms. Americans will pursue their interest, the Germans will do theirs. It is up to us to pursue ours. It is up to us to build the institutions, the capacities, and the intellectual ability and the backbone to pursue our self-interest. That is what is in East. What Professor Das described as colonialism, I will as an economist call it mercantilism. This is basically attempt to corner the market. At a micro level, every firm tries to do it. At the macro level, countries and their firms do it. So, but the other fact is that today about 2/3 of world trade in terms of tariff lines is happening through FTAs. Can we, as one of the largest economies in the world, be out of that game and still imagine we can benefit? I think not. So essentially what we have to focus on is the design of those agreements itself, the nuts and bolts of it. to defend what are my critical interests. But please remember, and those of you who are in business will appreciate this, that a trade agreement is essentially a glorified contract between two parties. When you go into any contract, there is a give and take, and there is, what we call policy space. You have to give it up because you have to commit to certain things, and there is punitive measures for contract deviation. Two firms, when they enter into a negotiation, don't agree on everything. If they would get the maximum profits they could make. It doesn't work that way, right? You agree to give up something and you enter into a contract and you stick to it, and there is punishment for contract deviation under law. So that is what trade agreements are. So let's take up first, and even despite NDTV being there, put my neck out, right? One of the most important narratives, in terms of the goods aspect of trade agreements has been the one specific one called the Asia and India Trade in Goods Agreement. Now, if you look at the trade data for, VAT, what is trade? The argument is that we have a huge negative balance of trade. We tend to import much more than we export to these countries, so this agreement is bad for us. Let me put 2 points in front of you. What is it that we import from the Asian economies? What is it that is largely driving this trade deficit? Coal, steel, palm oil, and electronic components. In the 10 years since I signed that agreement, my middle class has grown exponentially, which means I am consuming 5 times more processed foods, 10 times more cosmetics, all of which require palm oil. My domestic economy does not have an alternative to provide. So of course I am importing it for my consumers' needs. The cheap cosmetics somebody is buying in Meerut, the cheap processed foods, young people who work in IT firms and can't cook are buying in their supermarkets nearby would be 3 times more expensive. Do you want that as consumers? So I am importing what I need because my domestic economy cannot provide it. Do you want rather that 300,000 palm oil producers in Kerala are subsidized by a high tariff which you pay for out of your pockets? While millions, what is the welfare gain of that outcome? Right? Second, coal, steel, iron ore, we need it as the inputs for my own industries. If I don't get all of these at a cheap rate, my final products will not be competitive in the global market. Electronic components. Okay, a lot of them, earlier times were coming in simply as finished products, but for my PLI schemes to succeed, and please remember that the whole China Plus One has moved a lot of the component producers to countries like Vietnam and Malaysia. For my PLI schemes to succeed in those sectors, I need those components because thanks to some very intelligent policies to stop colonialism for 40 years, I have crippled my domestic industry, not just ITA. When people talk about, I am not disagreeing with the figures. Go to Manesar today. It's just not the Maruti Udyog's plant. There are 40 other parts and components plants which wouldn't have been there if this thing wouldn't have happened. They export. It is just not the cars that are being exported. Billions of dollars worth of components are being exported every day from our country. I belong to a generation, perhaps the last one, which was consigned to buying one horrible car at 1,30,000 rupees in the year 1988, which today, inflation adjusted, would be 27 lakh rupees. The Hindustan ambassador today would have cost 27 lakh rupees. That is what we were paying for. All of us were paying for it. So please be careful when you castigate free trade agreements and what it does for us. Now moving on to the other aspect of investment. Think about what the Korean FTA did for us. The Koreans are one of the smartest FTA negotiators. They negotiate not just because of trade, they think investment also, which we should start doing as well. They signed a trade agreement with us. They realized we have a trade agreement with the ASEAN countries. They started setting up plants here because they could import everything at zero duty. As the plants scaled up, today those same Korean plants are exporting out of India. What came as a market-seeking FDI has converted into efficiency-seeking FDI, not just because we had FTAs, because thankfully in the last 10 years, we have a smart industrial policy. We have an ease of doing business. When you put all of these things together, your market grows, your competitiveness grows. All of these are building blocks. Unfortunate truth was, before 8-9 years ago, we did not have this trio. It's a symphony. You can't have a single player playing it. You can't just have FTAs. You need all of these components. That is where the design, the thinking comes in. So moving on to the ESG, which I think Mr. Sanyal is bang on target. And there are three components. So the limited point I will make is, and I think it summarized it excellently, you have private standards, and they have been there for a while. Nestle says coffee plantations must work in a certain way. If they don't, I will not buy coffee beans from you. Zara, which is a massive Spanish conglomerate on apparel, say if you don't do certain things in your factory, I don't buy from you. So private standards. There's little you can do about it. It's driven by activism on the consumer side in these developed markets. Second is on the border side, unilateral measures like C-DEP, which you has come up with. Unfair, complete nonsense. Let us stand up to it, take it on. We have two avenues. You can either look at the multilateral avenue through WTO, and we are exploring what we can do there. The other is since we are negotiating an agreement with them, we can try and see what mitigation we can achieve. I leave it at that. The last point is that in trade agreements, in FTAs, what can you do? So far, and I will not disclose the existing negotiations, but so far what have we done? We have done nothing. We have simply committed to saying, I will uphold my existing labor and environmental laws. In fact, I have kept out my state governments from any application of these measures to them. I have insisted that the laws are simply, they have to be attuned to what my existing international commitments in UN and ILO are. So I have not really made any, and the point is India as a strong country today has the spine to resist all of this. If we are not resisting, that's a fair criticism. But the government is resisting push, at least in the FTAs, on these lines. Lastly, on digital, that's also different. I fully agree with Professor. There's an attempt to do certain things. Of course, they will attempt to do these things because it's good for their firms. It is up to me to prevent them from doing it. But let us not castigate the whole concept of a digital agreement because it has interest for me. Please remember that there are 500 what we call global capability centers in India. Almost every single Fortune 500 company has large R&D and digital innovation related activities going on in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, etc. That will also require some kind of aggressive protection. So there are elements of the digital technology and digital agreements which are with trust-based data flows. My services industries, the IT-enabled services industries which works with sensitive data will need that binding commitment so that in the future the partner countries don't prevent me from carrying out that business. So data flow with trust with certain exceptions is something is also in our interest. There is some the elements which says that the government cannot ask for the source code unless and until there is compelling reasons and those reasons are listed. I think that's a protection which we also need. I have a huge app-based economy. I'm one of the fastest innovating countries in the world. Tomorrow, if other markets start demanding the source code, which is the milk and honey of that whole business, and just take it from you, that is something I need to prevent. I need to put in the disciplines to prevent that. So there are elements in these agreements which are of interest to us. Not all of it is. What is not of interest, we should resist. Lastly, sir, to wind up on Professor Chaturvedi's point, I broadly agree with the fact that we need to improve on our export-import trade data. But to an extent, with the CBIC, the data is there. It's an effort for us to extract and work on it. Extraction, working on it can be facilitated. I'll tell you what the biggest challenge is when we go into trade negotiations. I have horribly bad domestic production data. I don't know what I am good at domestically. In order to even calculate the basic indices of import dependence. What do I mean by that? I mean, okay, I import $2 billion of a certain product. Let's say these mics. I import $2 billion. How much do I produce of these mics in my own country? If I produce only $1 billion, it shows that I am largely dependent on imports for this product. That is a different perspective than how you negotiate that product in a trade agreement. But if there is $20 billion of domestic production, then imports are a very small portion. It's a very different perspective. So without proper domestic production data, I am basically driving half blind. And that is where we need to put our efforts. We had this very nice ASI, Annual Survey of Industries, which need to be done in a much more robust manner. It's something we have been trying to look at. We've been trying to use GST and GST data, but there are issues of double counting, etc., which we need to come up with models for. I'll end there. Large message is FTAs is a tool. A tool can be used any way you want if you have the ability to use that tool. Don't throw the tool away. Focus on how you need to use the tool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me actually add to this, because see, do not in any way construe my suspicion of ESG as a neo-colonial tool with extrapolating into some step back into pre-1991 import substitution models. We wasted 40 years with an awful model. I'm glad Maruti Suzuki is making a lot of money here, because the alternative to it, I am unfortunately old enough to have actually learned to drive on those ambassadors, and I can assure you they were terrible. So there is no question that that piece of FDI was a turning point almost in our civilizational history. Right? So let us be very clear, never throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, we need to keep our eyes open when we do FTAs. But that is not an argument about not doing FTAs. That is merely a case of keeping out of those FTAs that do not work for us. And by the way, this government has been very clear. We kept out ourselves because it didn't seem to work with us. It was a case where we would have been inside the cage with the tiger. Right? So, by the way, since I was one of the people involved in that decision, let me say that we took a lot of criticism at that time, and I think President Biden, as of yesterday, agrees with what we did. So, point I'm making is that it is not about dealing with the world fearfully as we did in the immediate post-independence years. It is not about being blind to what the rest of the world wants to do, which is to pursue mercantilist interests. Our job is not to fear their mercantilist interest. Our job is to pursue our mercantilist interests. And hopefully in the last few years we have clearly demonstrated that, if it suited our purposes, we were willing to push back and say import Russian oil. We are unapologetic about it, and we will continue to be that. So in the same way, let me say that my pushback against ESG norms does not mean either, first of all, that I am against environmental and social governance norms in general. I think they may be suitable in various contexts. I am just saying that as and when we impose such rules and regulations, first of all, we should be party to deciding what those norms are. 2, we should decide who should be the certifying agency. 3, I don't see any reason why we should be paying rent to the rest of the world to certify something that we are entirely capable of doing ourselves. And importantly, the reciprocity of it should also apply. If there is a case where we are importing something, we should be asking them for certificates or giving them certificates. So I think the point I'm making here is not about engaging with the rest of the about sort of being afraid of dealing with the rest of the world. My argument is, yes, we need to deal with the rest of the world, and we need to do it with our eyes open. And where it suits us, we should play ball. Where it doesn't suit, sure, we should ask for a change of rules. So I want to be absolutely clear that anything I said about my discomfort with ESGs is not a case for driving the ambassador ever again.
So, building on top of what Sanjeev just said, I have a question for you, Pritam, is that needed more clarification on FTAs. So if we have an FTA, which is essentially allowing low tariff imports or zero tariff imports as ITAs, and the whole purpose of FTA is to increase imports, but also to increase exports, right? And that was the whole balance. If only imports are going up, that's a unilateral decision we could have taken at any point in time that make the BCD zero, the custom duty zero, and same with hardware. We can make custom duty zero, we can have the Korean imports as zero, and any year we feel we can change that because it's not an agreement. But when we get into an agreement, as you also said in your closing remarks, there should have been a component of exports, because the point is to have the balance rate. Imports is great, and so is exports, and that's the whole purpose. There seems to be a disconnect with them, so and how do we bridge that?
I'm very glad you asked that question. I'll take 5 minutes to explain. So sometimes you're
not increase of exports is actually not a bad thing, because actually it could have declined. And the classic example or lost it a little bit. We have not gone up because of this massive competition from China, but others have slipped massively. To an extent, have been able to hold on to whatever in that market because I have preferential access. If I did not have preferential access, if I had my goods had to pay tariffs, I would have probably slipped market share much faster. That's one. Second, there are large numbers of sectors where if I don't have an FTA, my exports will genuinely face greater competition because other partners have preferential access. And especially in low margin sectors where 3-4% makes a difference, this can be a killer. So it is in my export interest. Now, in many cases, we are not looking, in ASEAN as well, if I go line item by line item, there are areas where I have actually gained market share and exports have gone up. People look at the total number. The total number is often a little bit of a challenge because in many areas like natural resources, given that I am a huge consumer economy, I have tended to import a lot things which I need. Right? Now, second is what you said about why not do it unilaterally. When there's this whole concept of certainty. Right? And we have seen that countries including India, when they need to, they raise MFN tariffs because you have that water between bound and MFN appliers. You have that freedom to raise your tariffs. Now, if somebody is going to put, like the Koreans did, $1 billion plus investment, they want certainty in the supply chain. So when you commit to an FTA, that certainty becomes a factor that helps investments come in. This has happened world over. There's enough data to show it, and it definitely happened in the case of these two agreements, India and Japan, the FTAs that we signed. Last and very important point is that, again, coming back to the design of agreements, and it goes back to I think what Mr. Sanyal was trying to say. Every agreement that I sign, it allows me between, to keep 10 to 15% of my tariff lines out, which I can protect. Right? That's a large number of products. Not only that, of the remaining 85%, I can stagger my liberalization. I can reduce my tariffs over a period of 10, 15, whatever years, giving transition time to industry to face that shock. All of these tools are available to me and which we use. Now, I don't think it can be anybody's case in today's world that we remain an 80-year-old infant, because this comes from the infant industry agreement. Now, if I go around telling the whole world that I am the 5th largest economy, I have these aspirations, but 50% of my industry is infant, they can't compete. I need to prioritize because I have been given that element. I have more than 1,500 to 2,000 tariff lines I can protect vis-a-vis each particular country. And please don't tell me, Jaijit, that each country is brilliant at doing everything. They are not. So I have enough focused approach to identify where I am vulnerable vis-a-vis that economy and protect myself. I'll just take 30 seconds more to make another point which you have not raised, which is a very big concern. This is called circumvention of FTA rules. It is essentially a China problem, right? So I have an FTA with, let's say, Vietnam. I have given them zero duty access. China simply uses the Vietnam route to conduit their trade through them. So I am basically giving zero duty to the Chinese. So our response to that has been making complicated rules of origin. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. For lack of time, I will not go into it. There are better ways to do it. We need to learn how customs administrations in other countries use big data analytics to set of triggers and do investigations. We need to learn from those best practices, and we can do a very good job of stopping circumvention as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pritam. Thank you. So moving back to you, Sanjeev. Now you have been very close to policy making and you're driving some of the policy making. Could you tell us the economic vision of the current government and how that propel India into a dominant economy or Viksit Bharat? So what are the steps being taken given all the discussion that's going on? Where and how does the government see us moving forward given the various minefields and traps that we work in?
So let me first state where we are. So this year, this financial year, we will become a $4 trillion economy. Okay? We are also, as you know, by some margin, the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, in US dollar terms, we are now 5th largest. Japan, thanks to the collapse of the yen, is now just a little ahead of us at $4.1 trillion. So, either very early next year or even, who knows, this year, we will cross Japan to become the world's 4th largest economy. Beyond that, there is Germany, which is a $4.6 trillion economy. Now, its economy is also not growing, so makes it a static target. Maybe 2 years we will go past them, because remember, in nominal terms we are growing at in nominal dollar terms we're growing at about 10% or so. So therefore we will probably go past them in 1.5 to 2 years time. So I think in terms of becoming the world's 3rd largest economy, we are reasonably now close to the target. In purchasing parity terms, we already are the world's 3rd largest economy. So just to put it in context, we are now 8% of the world economy. So everybody loves remembering that we used to be once upon a time the 1/3 of the world economy. Well, we have been in decline for a long time, and by the time colonization got going in 1820, we were already gone down from 1/3 of the world economy in 1000 AD to 16%. And by the time the turn of this 19th century happened, we were down at 8%. By the time we became independent, we were about at 4.5%. By the 1980s, we were down to 3%, which tells you that independence actually, in terms of our economic significance, actually didn't help us much. It's only in the last 25-30 years that our share has been growing up, and so now we have gone back to about 8% of the world economy in PPP terms, which makes us already the world's 3rd largest economy, but importantly, it has only brought us back to where we were in 1900. Okay? The good news is that in PPP terms we are growing very, very fast, and to put it where the others are, we are about 8% of world economy. America in PPP terms is 15.5% of the world economy. So we are at about half their size in PPP terms, and China is at about 19% of the world economy in PPP terms. So once you look at it in PPP terms, we are doing rather well. But of course the problem is that we have to divide it by the world's largest population, so in per capita terms we are obviously still a very poor country. Nonetheless, where do we want to go from here? The first and important thing, most important thing, is that we have to maintain this compounding of growth. Some years we may get, like last year we got 8%, but my own sense is that given the constraints that our export markets are very weak and where we are, anything around 7% is a very good growth rate. We shouldn't get too excited about trying to hit 9%. I'm not a Keynesian, I'm a supply side. Do not push anything fiscal or anything trying to hit 8-9% growth. If we get it, great, but anything around 7% compounded over time, do remember, compounding is the single most important thing. So compound this growth, this is what will generate the jobs, this is what will generate the taxes to do whatever we want, and so on. So the first and most important thing, do not mess with the compounding of growth. Do not get emotional about trying to hit a very high growth rate in any particular year, which may disturb in any way the stability, because there are other countries, for example in Southeast Asia, which were in our position in the mid-90s, you will remember, Indonesia, Thailand and so on, and for a while they were doing very, very well, and then it all blew up in the Asian crisis, so, and they never quite got back on the rails again. So the point I'm making is, compounding and keeping it going for 30 years is very important, which brings me to my related second point, is that while we compound it, in order to keep it going, we have to remain conservatives macroeconomically. Do not mess around with the financial system trying to support growth. Do not mess around with your fiscal system, your monetary system, your current account, and so on. And in all of these things, even at the height of COVID, you will remember, we were very, very conservative. Right? We did what we needed to do. We created the safety nets where we needed to ease, but we did not go overboard like many other countries of the West particularly, or particularly like how many global experts were telling us to do. So, number 2 point, maintain macroeconomic stability, particularly keep the financial system clean. Cleaning up the banking system, let me tell you, is an extremely painful thing, not just for the banks and those who are getting bankrupted, but for policymakers. I have absolutely no intention of going through that ever again in my life. Number 3 point, maintain safety nets. You have to create safety nets because there is a significant proportion of the population that needs support. Do it directly. And here let me say that the conversation should be about absolute poverty and not about inequality and get diverted into all kinds of things that the likes of Piketty and others are trying to instigate. Our work should be about making sure the bottom of the pyramid, the word for that commonly used is Antuday, which means the Uday, i.e. the rise of the bottom. And so make sure that enough direct transfers are made to them, to whether it is in terms of building toilets or giving them free rations, or is in terms of cooking gas, whatever, or DBT transfers, whatever it is. Make sure that there's enough safety net kept in the way, and keep investing in them. So 3 points in this. Keep growth going. Whatever you need to do on the supply side, build infrastructure, ease of doing business, etc. Keep that going. 2, make sure you don't mess around. Growth should never be pushed using some, short-term thing. Macroeconomic stability is absolutely critical. And 3rd, make sure your safety nets for the very poor is sustained and built upon. So with those 3 general elements, move forward.
Great. I think that sounds terrific. But also next session we're going to talk about internationalization of rupee, and that's another thing that you're championing. And unfortunately, we will not have you in the next session. So, any thoughts on that? Where is India going on internationalization of rupee?
Yes, so internationalization of the rupee. By the way, first of all, because this conversation very often goes off into a conversation about de-dollarization. That's a different conversation altogether. Internationalization of the rupee is about converting the rupee into a hard currency. There are many hard currencies in the world. The euro is there, the yen is there, the Singapore dollar is there, GBP, yen, whatever. So we only aspire over the next decade or so to become a hard currency like many of the others. We are not attempting to becoming the world's anchor currency. The dollar, at least in my view, for the time being is there. There are many problems with it, and in the end those problems will all compound and catch up with them. But for the time being, we should accept that the dollar is the world's anchor currency. Our limited purpose is to convert the rupee into a hard currency over the next decade in terms of its wider usage as a currency of in which people trade, in particularly our own trade. It's a currency in which other governments in the world hold their reserves, in terms of being a part of the IMF's SDR basket. So that is our limited objective. In that context, we have done a few things already. One of them was simply to anchor our inflation rate, which we did through the inflation targeting mechanism, and it has worked reasonably well. 2, to create the payments mechanism, encourage, and you can see the RBI routinely is doing step by step. So we will, over a period of time, create a rupee market, and all of those things will happen, and the microstructures that are needed for making sure the back end of the payments and all that, so that the rupee essentially becomes a commonly used, hopefully commonly used, hard currency, at least commonly used for things relating to India, and then maybe over time for things generally more related in the rest of the world. So that is our limited objective, and we are moving towards it. We have maybe by somewhere in the very early 2030s we should be there.
Sounds good. On a lighter note, that will make life easier for those who are traveling abroad for tourism. You can simply carry rupee in their pocket and enjoy. Thank you, Sanjeev. So moving to you, Professor Chaturvedi, there has been a narrative that India has been a frequent user of anti-dumping duties. This narrative is used to beat down India. However, as per the Center for Digital Economy Policy's report, which was released this morning, India is one of the least user of trade remedies when looked at from the perspective of number of times an ADD is renewed, post-sunset review, and also the quantum of ADD that we put in. The anti-dumping duty quantum is also very little. It's more of little bites that we do rather than those major chunks that US and others do. And on the other hand, it is actually the advanced economies who use ADD the most. How do we counter such narratives that does damage to India's position as a responsible trading economy?
Absolutely right, and I think sometimes we are over-conscious in terms of how we respond globally. And if you see in the beginning of this century, India over-leveraged some of these instruments. One, we were criticized in the WTO annual report that we have overdone it. And since then the retreat happened, and we have been trying to see how we counter sort of argue in terms of what other countries were doing. And I was going through the data that DGTR has released. If you see the numbers, and if you see the anti-dumping working group report of WTO, you find that India's ability to come up with some of these instruments and our willingness to do that, you find a huge gap. Your industry is complaining, your firms are complaining, and the cases are hovering between the normal value, the export value, and the difference which as part of injury is to be established. So the point that, and I'm re-emphasizing on that point, in terms of reliable statistics for our firms to substantiate the injury that is required. We fighting against Bangladesh for anti-dumping or even some smaller countries. No. Look at China, the way China has dumped, the way multiple instrumentalities are being leveraged. The credit that is coming along with Chinese exports to India, the credit that our importers are leveraging, you find those multiple dimensions coming in which we have not leveraged. That's one part of the story. The earlier point which you made in terms of bringing in MSME into this picture, I think is extremely important. And this again goes back to what Pritam was saying in terms of we not paying attention even on production statistics, domestic production statistics. The last survey that was done to know what is the status of MSME in this country, can you believe, was done in 2006. Whatever we are saying today that India's exports has 45% of share of MSME, completely misleading. Completely misleading. Because that 2006 survey actually got finalized in 2007 and was published in 2011. After 2011, MSME ministry hasn't bothered to come up with another survey. So as a result, what happened during COVID crisis, and I'm more worried about the micro enterprises, leave aside small and medium enterprises, which in any case are getting some attention, but micro are the ones which are compromised. There are needs in terms of how these entities are getting influenced when you have change of regime, particularly with FTAs and with imports that are happening. So from that perspective, anti-dumping or any remedial measure that is required to protect interests of small and medium enterprises require far more evidence-based decision making, both relevant for MSME but also relevant for our trade instrumentalities. And from that perspective, I think three tasks are absolutely clear. What Sanjeev said in terms of our statistics and our ability to take a call. Much more important, and Pritam also referred to the annual survey of industries. We need to see how state level interventions are to be made. Prime Minister has given a call for making districts as hub for exports. If you go to any district, which district would tell you number of units, number of exporting units, and number of units which are part of some production chains in the country. District level GDP is a concept, time for which has come.
Fortunately, for last 3 years, I was associated with Madhya Pradesh as Deputy Chairman of their Planning Commission, and we introduced in Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh now is the only state in the country to have their own statistical commission, and this statistical commission has undertaken 4 pilots at district level. The work now would be finished later next month in terms of calculating district level GDP. And this, I think, is important for us to create an insulating framework to protect those industries. And that's where the evidence is coming from. So I think we require several of these decisions to be based on solid empirics. And that's where more relevant and targeted decision making can be done, both by central government and also by somehow this impression comes in that imports, as you were saying, imports are bad and exports are good, and that's where then our mind frame moves forward. I think again, Pritam said absolutely correct that FTA is just an instrument. We need to use it. So from that perspective, even the remedial measures that we are going to use or we are intending to use, they would be effective only when we have clear evidence and our firms are not going around in terms of collecting that status.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like significant strengthening of the institutional frameworks that we have, and clearly that will help us significantly. Moving to you, Professor Das, and actually we are running out of time, but how do we strengthen the government-industry collaboration during FTA agreements? And you know, nobody is saying that FTA is bad. What we are saying, the FTAs are badly architected, especially from our perspective, because it's great that imports are happening, but it should also be great that exports should happen along with it. So that we get FTAs that are more aligned to Indian industry, which includes MSMEs. And how do we ensure that the capability of MSMEs are well captured in these negotiations? And we have been part of this for about 3 decades. So what's your experience of this?
Thanks, Jaijit. When it comes to question of negotiating FTAs that are in,
FTAs that are in India's interest. Let me go back to the Maruti question. That will really clarify. Before we signed the FTA with Japan, government had the flexibility and government exercised the flexibility to put a cap on how much royalty could be charged by Suzuki. Not only that, government had the flexibility to put a restriction on how much of royalty could be repatriated. Because of the FTA, we lost both the flexibilities. So I'm not grudging the investment coming in. Investment was absolutely welcome. But we lost the flexibility to ensure that the spillovers in the domestic economy on account of that investment would be enhanced. The forward and backward linkages would be strengthened. That is the problem with FTAs. If we do not negotiate the provisions carefully, we will be in trouble. Linked with that, let me give you the illustration of India-UK FTA which we are negotiating. There is a very good study by the UK Department of Trade which says that on account of this FTA, India's exports on an annual basis to UK on account of the FTA of both goods and services, keep that in mind, will be 1 billion pounds every year. 1 billion pound? When our combined exports is about $775 billion, it's not even a drop in the ocean. What do we stand to lose? Policy flexibility in important areas such as digital trade or green technology. I'm sure the government is negotiating hard, but let's also be clear that UK will also be negotiating hard. So where does the balance lie? To what extent are we willing to give up our policy flexibility, particularly in those sectors which are going to be burgeoning, which will have much greater growth in future, digital and green products? That is my problem. Loss of flexibility, which these FTAs end up doing. On the issue of industry-government collaboration, the consultations which normally government holds are with epic chambers or confederations. Government really rarely goes down to the product level associations. And that is where the consultation mechanism has to change. It has to be with product level associations, and that's where you will get the inputs from MSMEs. So hope that helps.
Thank you so much. Just a quick closing remark from you, Sanjeev. You're the chair of this session, and then we'll close this discussion.
Thank you very much. So I'll just sum up, and I think we all agree here that we need to go into this deal with the world with a much more open eyes. If we are going to be in the next few years the world's third largest economy, we should begin to have the confidence of pushing our interests clearly. And by the way, one of the experiences is that if we are very clear about what we want, it also makes, interestingly, our partners also clear about what to negotiate with us about. Because you see, one of the problems of a pre-liberalization mindset was we said no to many things, but we were never clear what we actually wanted. If we are, on the other hand, clear about what we want, you will find our partners are very often quite happy to accommodate it. Of course, we will then have to adjust to some of their interests as well. Very often, it is not the case that it hurts us too much to accommodate to their interests. That's what give and take is about. A very good example of that in the last couple of years has been our import of Russian crude. It's something we were, the world was a little unhappy about in the beginning, but then they accepted it and we continued doing it. And it was a big cushion during that phase where oil prices went spiking through the roof. So the world will accommodate us if we are clear what we want. But of course, the quid pro quo is that we are also good citizens when it comes to their interests. And very often a small adjustment on our side in some completely different sphere may not even be an economic issue, very often is good enough to do that. So I think the point here is that we need to be cognizant of what our interests are, to push it clearly, make the trade-offs. And I think our partners, business, investment partners, trade partners, will also be cognizant of both our interests and their interests, which we have to then adjust for. The point is, let's be confident enough to deal with the rest of the world, rather than sort of see it as some sort of a threatening place that we should either be fearful of, or some place that we have to surrender to.
Thank you, Sanjeev. It's been brilliant discussions and absolutely scintillating. I end up learning a lot, and I'm sure that's the case with everybody else. And thank you, Professor Das, and Pritam just left, but excellent points by Pritam, and thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi. We'll continue these conversations in various forums, because this is important to be discussed, and it's important for everybody to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So thank you so much. With that, we'll close this session.